Sanguinius, the Primarch of the Blood Angels. He was slain during the Horus Heresy, but what if fate had trodden a different path, and he hadn't met his demise aboard the Vengeful Spirit? What if he'd fallen to the corrupting powers of chaos himself? Well, in this video I'm going to be exploring just that, as I explore another Dornian Heresy kitbash, and show you how to build a Nurgle Corrupted Sanguinius. With any kitbash, the most important step is selecting the base model. It's a decision that will drive the direction of the build, and in the case of this miniature, I selected Katakros from the Ossiarch Bone Reapers. There are lots of directions to go when it comes to a corrupted Primarch, but for this build I decided to stick to more of a regular Primarch size rather than the usual giant demon Primarchs that we've received so far. Katakros is perfect for this. He stands roughly the same height as the non-demon Primarchs, and his exoskeleton of bone meshes incredibly well with the stylized muscular armor of the Sanguinor and the Sanguinary Guard. The more organic appearance of the armor lends itself to that chaotic theme too, helping to set apart this model as being corrupted. After removing and cleaning up the parts, the first modification was to the chest. Katakros' cloak wouldn't be used in this build, and so the small section attached to the chest piece was clipped and trimmed back to the medallions. The 3 discs on Katakros' chest gave me the perfect opportunity to both recreate the original Sanguinius' bejeweled armor, whilst also creating a symbol of Nurgle. But first, the existing symbols needed to be removed. This was done by first drilling some 1mm pilot holes into the dead center of each of the discs. These holes were then expanded out using a 3mm bit, leaving me with 3 large holes where the medallions and crystal once sat. Finally, the chest piece was glued to the rest of the torso. To fill in these holes and to act as rounded jewels, 3 ball bearings were superglued into place. These were each 3mm in diameter, so they fit into the pre-drilled holes perfectly. To recreate the iconic feathered wings of Sanguinius, I took the wings from the Stormcast Indrasta. They are the right size and are very similar to Sanguinius' wings, but this is a Nurgle Corrupted version, and so they needed to be modified slightly. Using a knife, a few nicks and cuts were added to the edges of the feathers. These varied in shape and size in order to recreate that slightly more ragged look you'd expect from a chaotic version of the fallen Primarch. But before we go on, let's hear from the sponsors of this video, Enlisted. Step into the heart-pounding action of World War II with Enlisted, the ultimate multiplayer shooter that brings historical authenticity to life while keeping the gameplay dynamic and intense. Available on PC, Xbox Series X and S, PlayStation 5, as well as PS4 and Xbox One. Enlisted offers cross-platform support, so you can join the fight with players from all platforms. Enlisted takes you to the front lines with its large-scale combat, where you command dozens of soldiers, light vehicles, armored vehicles, and aviation across distinct historical campaigns like the Battle for Moscow and the Invasion of Normandy, with each campaign offering unique maps, troops, weapons, vehicles, and more for you to unlock. Join the battle both on the ground and in the air with an ever-expanding arsenal of armored cars, tanks, fighters, bombers, and more. Enlisted also features hundreds of weapons to choose from, including rare prototypes and even trial weaponry. From equipment and uniforms to vehicles and locations, everything is crafted with authenticity in mind. Engage in tactical gameplay and squads mode. Customize each soldier with their own name, skills, and inventory. Give them orders or take control of any member of your squad at the press of a button. Fight over destructible environments, adding a new layer of realism to the battlefield, or, if you prefer to build, construct vital structures from sandbag fortifications to stationary machine guns, anti-tank cannons, and more as an engineer. But best of all, Enlisted is completely free to play. Just follow the link, download the game, and get ready to experience the most immersive World War II shooter. Don't miss out on this epic experience. Simply use my link below and receive 3 days of premium and several orders for troops and weapons. With the nicks completed, the wings were compared against Katakros' back. Naturally, they didn't fit particularly well, and so needed some extensive clipping and trimming. This was done not only to create a better alignment, but also adjust the angle of the wing against the back. Once everything was lining up, I broke out the old pin vise to do a bit of pinning. A couple of 1mm holes were drilled into the nubs of the wings, and some 1mm wire was superglued into each. The small pins were then compared against the back once again, which gave me a rough idea of where to drill the receiving holes. Once these were in place, the wings were superglued into place, giving me a much stronger bond than if I'd used plastic glue alone. Next up was the head. Deciding on the direction I wanted to go here took a while. Should I tackle a bare head and look into the Soulbite Gravelord's range, or should I try to recreate that Sanguinor Death Mask look? I went through a few variations here, but ultimately settled on a combination of this Malachai head and Talos Mask from the Drukhari range. These two parts were joined by first clipping away the small nub on the Malachai hair, before gluing the two parts together and then into the back of the mask, creating the head shape. The head was then compared against Catacross's neck. Further trimming and clipping was required until the hair and mask could be glued against the neck. However, it wasn't until the head was in place that I realised that the spiky chin looked a little off. So the head was carefully removed from the neck. Fortunately, the glue wasn't fully cured, so this wasn't too difficult. I was still really happy with the mask though. It mimicked the kind of helmets you see on the Putrid Blight Kings, and so helped to build up that link between the Sanguinius and Nurgle. It just needed a little trimming. The bottom of the mask was clipped and trimmed down to a more reasonable size, and the contact points were cleaned up before gluing the now better scaled head into place. The removal of the cloak had exposed a few gaps in the shoulders. While these could have been filled in with little green stuff, some power armor shoulder pads would do the job too. Some Sanguinary Guard shoulder pads were selected for this task, but first they needed a little trimming for them to fit against the arms. Not only would these shoulders help to move the conversion away from the original Catacross model, but they would also bring back some of those design elements of the original Sanguinius. With the shoulders in place, the torso and legs continued to be assembled. Sanguinius is armed with a sword and spear. Catacross already came with a glaive-like weapon, so this was less of a problem. However, Catacross's shield would need to be removed to make way for a sword. Using my clippers, I carefully clipped the hand away from the top of the shield, before carefully trimming the hand until it had more of a partially closed fist look to it. The hand was then glued to its arm. As the sword would be held point down, I needed to select something that was long enough to reach the ground and have the arm resting on it. The Vanquishers from Age of Sigmar had the perfect blade, but it was looking a little too pristine for a blade of Nurgle. Using a pin vise and a combination of 1mm and 2mm drill bits, a series of shallow holes were drilled into the surface of the blade. Along with a couple of full holes, these formed the appearance of corrosion eating away at the metal, giving the sword that ideal Nurgle look. The handle would need to be replaced though, so it was first clipped away. The new hilt was formed from a femur taken from the Cryptghoul kit. One end was cut away before yet more pinning was used to attach the bone to the sword. Once detached, the sword was compared against the hand, but wasn't glued to it just yet. The spear, on the literal other hand, was a little more straightforward though. The blade and pommel of the glaive were first clipped away before smoothing the contact points flat. These would be replaced by a Putrid Blight King spearhead, which needed a slight piece clipped away, along with a Death Guard Nurgle symbol. To ensure the best fit possible, these were also attached with pins. Just make sure that you attach the spear's shaft first to make sure that the blade fits well against the hair and the wings. Unfortunately, part of Catacross's hand was still attached to his cloak. The fingers were clipped away, tidied up, and then glued to the hand. Part of the hand was still missing here, but this would be resolved later on. From here, the only tasks left were to add a few extra details. To help bring in a little more Nurgliness, a severed head and pipe were taken from the Death Guard kit and attached to the torso. This was followed up with a couple of blood vials which were sourced from a Swamp Caller Shaman's backpack. After clipping and trimming, they were attached to the rear of the sash. Another Nurgle symbol, this time taken from the Ogroid Therodons, was also attached after a quick trim to the rear. This was followed up by a final weapon in the form of a Cerberus Raider's pistol. The Mechanicus symbol was removed, and this too was added to the waist, completing the model. which meant I could begin work on the base. The main structure was formed by layering up chunks of torn up cork floor tiles. These were layered up and superglued together to create the appearance of a rocky outcrop. To work out how the sword should be attached, the model and the sword were lined up against the top of the rocks. Then, to make up the height, a little more cork was used to prop up the sword, and then finally glue it to the hand. In order to give the base that Nurgle Corrupted appearance, a few tentacles from the Beast of Nurgle kit were trimmed down and superglued in between the gaps in the rocks. These were all positioned so they were raised up where Sanguinius would stand. The blank spaces around the rocks were then filled in with a few smaller chunks of cork of varying shapes and sizes, but to give the model a little adversarial detail, a Primaris intercessor forearm was clipped away from its shoulder and trimmed down. By gluing this to the base, with the hand facing up, it gave the appearance of a space marine being swallowed whole by some vile sludge. To make painting easier, Sanguinius would be painted separately from his main base, but he would still need something to stand on to be painted. So he was temporarily attached to a much smaller base by a tiny amount of superglue. The final details left to be added had to be sculpted on, so a small amount of green stuff was cut up and mixed together. The first details to add were a few extra panels around Sanguinius' armour. A small sphere was placed over the back of the right hand before being flattened and shaped to mimic the armour plating around it. Similar gaps were then filled in around the wings, helping to blend them into the model more effectively. Finally, the putty was rolled up into thin sausages and wrapped around where the hand was reaching up from the base. The rolls were smoothed out and blended to give them the appearance of ripples in the thick sludge. And with that, the models were given a chance to cure before moving on to the painting. The first step in painting was, as always, to prime, and for this I chose black, specifically a gloss black primer from Vallejo. This was chosen as the glossy surface will help to give the golden armour that extra shine, and was applied across the entirety of the model. However, for the base, I used a regular black primer. There weren't any metallics here, so the glossy surface wasn't needed. To give Sanguinius a bright, gleaming gold look to his armour, I opted to use some of Vallejo's metal colours. These can be applied with a brush, but the best results are achieved via an airbrush. The paints are also pre-thinned for airbrushing, so you can apply them without having to thin them out yourself. For my first step, I used some copper. With my airbrush ready, I sprayed the paint across the whole armour. I did try not to overspill onto the wings and spear too much, but these overspills will be cleaned up later on. To achieve the best results, the paint was applied in one layer and allowed to dry before applying a second. Combined with the gloss primer, the result was a much more reflective, metallic look. The copper was an excellent starting point, but the armour needed to be golden. So a little metal colour gold was mixed into my copper in a roughly 1 part copper to 2 parts gold ratio. Again, this was sprayed across the armour, but this time the paint was focused more towards the upper areas. These created the appearance of a brighter armour towards the top of the model, where the light would be the most intense. This principle was extended even further with some pure gold. By applying this to only the most prominent points of the armour, the result was a more realistic transition between the brighter areas and the more shaded recesses. Sanguinius' armour has lots of deep recesses, and darkening these down would give the model a lot more definition. A wash would be perfect for this. Rather than using a pre-made wash, I decided to make my own by combining some Cygor Brown contrast paint, due to its reddish brown colour, with some airbrush thinner. This mix still benefits from the strength of the contrast paint whilst reducing the viscosity greatly. The wash was targeted directly into the recesses. Over the smooth, glossy surface, the paint pooled into crevices. Here it dried and created the appearance of shadows, boosting that level of detail. During the previous step, a few spots of the Cygor Brown spilled outside of those recesses and left a small amount of staining on the surfaces. Under normal circumstances, this would be a bad thing, but for a Nurgle miniature, this simply created a corroded and stained surface. I further expanded on this by adding a few small spots of Black Legion contrast paint around these areas in order to further emphasize that corroded effect. With the gold details completed, the silver metallics could be worked on. The weapon blades and potion bottle hooks were all painted with a base coat of Surcoat Silver from the 2 thin coats range. As a base coat, this was first thinned out with a little water and applied in, unsurprisingly, 2 thin coats. Following this, I lined the edges of the silver details with a small amount of Mythril Blade. As a brighter metal, it gave the edges an extremely sharp looking edge. But to add that corroded effect, yet more Cygor Brown was applied. This time, however, some contrast medium was used to thin it out rather than the airbrush thinner. The result was a little more viscous than before, but this helped it to sit on and stain the flat surfaces. To really push that rusted effect though, I turned to some Dirty Down Rust. A few small spots of this liquid skill result in some extremely realistic looking rust effects. By focusing this weathering to just the inner parts of the panels, it gave the edge the appearance of having rust scratched away through use. After this, I cleaned out my paint water to prevent cross-contamination of those metal flakes into my non-metallic paints. For the remaining areas, I followed the same few steps of base coat, highlight, extreme highlight, and then glaze. The first area of focus was the hair. Normally this would be a light blonde, but to give Sanguinius that corrupted look, I went with a greyish faded white. This was started out with a base coat of Wizard Grey. Like with the Surcoat Silver, it thinned it out with a little water and applied it in 2 thin coats. For the first highlight, some Carcharadon Grey was used to line the individual strands of hair, before applying some small dots of White Star to only the most prominent strands of the hair. This is often referred to as an extreme highlight and can really build up the sharpness of those details. Finally, to help tie together those previous layers, a glaze was applied. This was created by mixing some Apothecary White contrast paint into some medium. The resultant translucent mixture smoothed out the blends between the 3 previous paints. To paint the stitched skin sash and severed head, I began with a base coat of Barbarian Brawn, before applying a chunky edge highlight of Dwarven Skin, and then a finer, more extreme edge highlight of Elven Skin. Finally, some Guilliman Flesh was applied as a glaze. This helped to blend together the highlights and base coat, whilst also giving those deeper recesses a little more shading. Following this, the staples holding together the flayed skin were picked out with some Surcoat Silver. The next area of focus was the wrapping around the spear. These were given an initial base coat of Royal Cloak, an edge highlight of Sword Hilt Burgundy, and an extreme highlight of Glistening Gums, 2 more prominent edges along the folds. The wrappings were then coated with a glaze of Volupus Pink. Next up were the wings. Normally these would be white, but in a similar vein as the white hair, I opted for a black-grey colour instead. This would not only represent the more corrupted side of this take on Sanguinius, but it would also contrast nicely against the brighter gold of the armour. For this task, a few thin layers of Death Reaper were applied. For the highlights though, instead of applying 2, I instead opted to apply 3. The first of these was Cold Corpse Blue, and this was applied across all of the edges of the feathers. In addition to the edges, a few extra lines were added, running perpendicular to the edges of the feathers. This just helped to give this large area of the model a little extra detail. The second highlight covered the slightly more prominent edges, but wasn't as specific as the extreme highlights. For this, I used Wolf Grey. The highlights were then finished off with some small spots of Gravestone Blue. The overall greyish blue created by these highlights offered a cooler counterpoint to the warmer tones used elsewhere on the model. Finally, those highlights were blended together with a glaze of Space Wolf's Grey. The next area of focus were the red details. These included the gems on the chest as well as the bottom halves of the potion bottles. All of these were painted with a base coat of Berserker Red. Rather than going straight to the highlights though, the next step involved applying some medium-thinned Sanguine Scarlet to create smooth gradients. For the gems, the application was focused towards the bottom right of the gem. By layering up the paint and covering a slightly smaller area than before, it created a gradient across the gem. For the potion bottles, the same technique was repeated, but this time it was focused towards the top of the red area so that it got darker towards the bottom. From here, more traditional highlights were applied using some Demon Red. Again, that same gradient direction was followed, with this brighter red helping to give the gems that glossy, translucent effect. This was followed up with a few small spots of Fanatic Orange. And then finally, a glaze of Blood Angel's Red to help boost the intensity of the red and blend those layers together. To finish off the gem effect on the chest, some small dots of White Star were applied to the upper left of each gem. This mimicked their reflection spot and helped to build on the illusion of the gems being slightly transparent and slightly glossy. Usual service was then resumed across the leather details by starting off with Cuirass Leather, highlighting with Boar Hide, and extreme highlighting with Fur Cloak. The bone handle of the sword was then base coated with Dust Bowl, followed up by a highlight of Sandstone, and then Ivory Tusk. Finally, the bone was coated with the glaze of Skeleton Horde. The final step in painting Sanguinius saw me add a bit of gore to the model, further helping to sell that corrupted aspect of him. This effect was achieved by mixing together some Black Legion contrast paint with some of Tamiya's clear red. The mix gave the impression of dried, congealed blood and was applied around the bottom of the mask, the weapons, and in a few spots across that skin sash. With Sanguinius complete, he could be given an all-over coat of gloss varnish to help retain that gleaming armor. With Sanguinius completed, my attention could return to the base. I began by using my airbrush to quickly base coat the tentacles with Royal Cloak, before hitting them with a quick layer of Sword Hilt Burgundy. To give the rocks an earthy green colour, I mixed together Scorched Earth and Ethereal Green, and gave all the rocks a base coat. While I use an airbrush for these stages, it's not entirely necessary, it just makes the application a little quicker. The rocks were then given a coat of Battle Mud Wash. This flowed into the recesses and helped to give all of those deep crevices a little more definition. This definition was then built upon by dry brushing a mixture of Ancient Forest and Ethereal Green. Here the paint accumulated just on the raised edges, offering a counterpoint to the darker, shaded recesses. The highlights were pushed even further with a second dry brush of Wasteland Brown and Ethereal Green. To fill in the empty areas around the rocks, some texture paste was applied. I selected the aptly named Playground from AK Interactive for this. The lurid green complemented the greens nicely whilst also firmly cementing the base as being in a garden of Nurgle. The protruding Space Marine hand was then painted up as an Ultramarine, a faction within the Dornian Heresy that are enemies of both the Loyalist and Traitor Legions. Painting this arm followed the same usual steps. I began with Marine Blue, highlighted with Elysium Blue, and finally Celestial Blue. To paint the toxic sludge around the hand, the first step was to lighten up the surface with a base coat of White Star. Over the top of this, a disgusting mixture of AK Clear Water and Bad Moon Yellow contrast paint was applied. This resulted in an extremely lurid looking liquid effect. A couple of layers were added to really build up the brightness of this liquid. By this point, the texture paste had dried, which meant it could be dry brushed with some yellow flame, before being glazed with some Mantis Warriors green contrast paint. The tentacles were then given a couple of highlights, first with Glistening Gums, and then a little Dwarven Skin, followed up with an all-over glaze of Doomfire Magenta to cement that purpley pink colour. The rim of the base was then cleaned up with some Doom Death Black, before all the paintwork was sealed in with a coat of matte varnish. A few final details were then added in the form of tendrils of slime between the tentacles. These were created by stretching and pulling out threads of some Yoo-hoo glue using the tip of a cocktail stick. As it dried, it gave the effect of thick globs of slime. The tentacles and sludge pool were then given a glossy sheen again by applying a coat of gloss varnish, before adding a little foliage to the base in the form of some grass tufts of various shades of greens and browns. Finally, Sanguinius could be snapped away from his temporary base and, using some pinning for one final time, attached to his new base, leaving me with this. And here we have the completed Nurgle Corrupted Sanguinius from the Dornian Heresy. This was my third non-traditional Primarch build, but it is the first one that hasn't involved using a different Primarch miniature to build it. Overall, I'm really pleased with how well using Katakros as a basis for this build turned out. There was a little hiccup with the mask, but I think I managed to pull it back to something that is ultimately still recognisable as Sanguinius, but also has a strong corrupted aspect. So if you enjoyed this guide, be sure to check out some of my previous alternate heresy builds, and leave me your own suggestions for which Primarch I should tackle next. But if you're looking to recreate this miniature and colour scheme, I'll include all the kits and paints used in this guide in the description below, along with some affiliate links to where you can pick them up for yourself. But before I go, I just want to say a big thank you to Enlisted for sponsoring this video. Remember to check out the game with my link to receive some awesome bonuses. See you on the battlefield. My biggest thanks go to the Patreon supporters and channel members who help keep this channel going, especially my expert tier and above supporters, who are Jonathan Hart, Maciej Savitsky, Morgan, Ryan Little, Swedsman, Tim, Daniel Dowling, Immaterial Creations, Johans, Jonathan Sandsteed, Mr. Grimm, Pale Juice, and the Googles, and my Sergeant level channel members, who are Fair Statement, Mr. Jared Hess 95, Nerdington Paints, Mark Taylor, Will Tussler, and Philip Poyer. If you're interested in supporting me, you can hit the join button below or find a link to my Patreon in the description. Supporters get a whole host of benefits, including ad-free access to my videos, sneak peeks, a private Discord channel, and exclusive merchandise. Speaking of merchandise, I also have a few t-shirts and mugs up for sale featuring designs drawn by me. You can check those out by following the links below or by going over to petethewargamer.com. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.